Welcome. You're listening to the Malcontent News Russia-Ukraine War podcast, the show that cuts through the fog of war and updates you about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts.
Hello, I'm Marina Yevshan, your host of the Russia-Ukraine War Report podcast, and today is June the 5th, 2024. It has been 3,782 days since Russia started covert military operations in Crimea, 10 years and 106 days since the start of the Russia-Ukraine war, and 2 years and 103 days since Russia expanded its war aggression. Today's podcast looks at events that happened on Tuesday and Wednesday morning. During the podcast, you will find the Russia-Ukraine war map helpful to visualize the areas discussed. A link is in the podcast description. There are only minor map updates today. The Russia-Ukraine War Report is compiled by our team from around the world. Today's report includes information from our direct contacts and journalists in Ukraine, the Russian Ministry of Defense, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine morning reports, operational commands north, south and east of Ukraine, open source intelligence, our in-house team of analysts and geospatial experts, and pro-Ukrainian and pro-Russian male bloggers and social media channels with a track record of trying to be accurate. We have one mission, the truth, because the truth matters. Here is my daily assessment. There are only small changes from yesterday, so if you want to skip ahead, it won't hurt my feelings. I won't even know. 1. We maintain Russia's ongoing spring-summer offensive failed to achieve any of its operational goals after 45 days. 2. The sharp increase in aggressive acts by the Russian Federation directed at the NATO alliance and its member nations is a direct result of the failed policy of de-escalation and excessive fear of Moscow's tactical nuclear threats. We maintain the world is caught in the mutually assured destruction and stability paradox. 3. We maintain that Russia is setting conditions to commit further acts of aggression in Europe. 4. We maintain that autocrat Vladimir Putin's offer to negotiate a ceasefire based on the current line of conflict is not an overture made in good faith. It is meant to derail the upcoming June the 15th–16th Peace Conference in Switzerland, which more than 100 nations will attend. 5. Russia's sustained attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, which has destroyed 95% of its thermal power plant capacity, are a continuation of Russian crimes against humanity that started in October 2022, as outlined in 2 arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court on March the 5th. 6. Ukrainian personnel shortages are extending deployment times, limiting troop rotations, and forcing combatant effective units to maintain defensive positions, which is contributing to Russia's ability to make small tactical advances in some areas of operation. 7. Russian forces continue to exploit the delays in significant military aid from the US, the Czech Republic-led Ammunition Initiative, and the European Union, carrying out at least 99 attacks on Tuesday and 137 on Monday. 8. We maintain that the quantity of artillery ammunition available to Ukrainian forces is increasing, but has not reached a level that will enable the stabilization of their defensive lines across the entire line of conflict. 9. Russia's trampling of international humanitarian law has been accelerating since March the 22nd. We maintain that the willful ignoring of blatant Russian war crimes by international watchdogs will continue to encourage escalation. 10. Autocrat Putin has started the largest purge of the Russian Ministry of Defense, led by the FSB, since Joseph Stalin's 1936 to 1938 purge. 11. We maintain the possibility of a large-scale Russian attack into the Sumy Oblast from Russia or the Kyiv Oblast from Belarus is extremely low. 12. The attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure have incrementally increased the chance of an intentional nuclear accident at multiple nuclear facilities in Ukraine. Russia conducted limited attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure on Tuesday. 27 Shahed 136 one-way drones were launched at Ukraine, with 22 intercepted. At the time of recording, there were no reports of civilian casualties. Since the United States authorized the use of all weapon systems except ATACMS on Russia, There have not been any S-300 missile attacks on the city of Kharkiv, and the number of VKS, that's the Russian Aerospace Forces, sorties has been halved. A Russian attack on Kupiansk in the Kharkiv Oblast wounded a 59-year-old man and heavily damaged his home. The head of the Kherson Oblast Military Administration, Alexander Prokudin, reported that a pensioner was killed in the village of Volotensk. The settlement of Belozerka was shelled, targeting retail shops. A 55-year-old woman in a coffee shop was injured and is in hospital. A pensioner suffered a closed skull brain injury and is expected to recover. The settlement of Konotop in the Sumy Oblast was hit by rockets fired from Russia, targeting an industrial plant. The facility was heavily damaged and one person was injured. Khotin was shelled with mortars, wounding 2 civilians. A Russian missile strike on Kryvyi Rih in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast wounded a pensioner. Ukraine had to implement emergency blackouts due to high demand and instability in the electrical grid. Officials appealed for people to conserve electricity. For example, yesterday I had electricity for almost 6 hours in general, 1 hour at night, an hour and a half in the morning, and 3.5 hours in the evening. Today seems to be dark too. Here is today's action report. Russia's spring-summer offensive is in its 46th day, with 137 assaults carried out on Monday and, at the time of publication, 99 attacks on Tuesday. Through June the 3rd, the 7-day moving average for attacks was at 114, down from the May the 16th the 17th peak of 136. The number of daily attacks has been trending downward since May the 20th. Russian forces concentrated their attacks in the Ocheretine area, northwest of Avdiivka, trying to break through Ukrainian defenses. Russian troops did make some small gains, but not enough for us to adjust the map. There are indications that Russian forces are experiencing increasing issues with having enough trained personnel and mobility. Lawyers representing hundreds of conscientious objectors in Russia reported that 40 men armed with machine guns and batons arrived in Yekaterinburg and gathered up to 180 refuseniks. The news publication Verstka claimed the men were forced onto buses, some handcuffed, brought to a nearby military airfield and flown directly to occupied Ukraine. The incident occurred in May. Their lawyers reported the men were sent to occupied Donetsk, Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts to permit more experienced troops to rotate to the Kharkiv region. Russian oppositional news source Astra reported that wounded Mobiks from military unit 98592, who were awaiting release from military service due to severe wounds, cancer, tuberculosis and mental health issues, were deceived into being redeployed. Family members claim that on May the 31st the group was told to board buses in Stavropol to be transported to Rostov-on-Don for questioning. Instead, the bus took them to the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, where they were immediately deployed. Astra also reported that dozens of refuseniks in Yakutsk, Orenburg and Primorye were forcibly deployed. New analysis of satellite images shows that Russia has pulled the last 54 T-80UD main battle tanks from their storage facility. During May, 16% of all Russian tanks destroyed were T-62 variants, the highest level since October 2022. The number of T-72 tanks lost has declined, while losses of the T-80 grew. The data suggests that Russia is fielding more of the Cold War-era T-62 medium-duty tanks as they churn through their reserves. Last week, we reported that satellite images showed that Russia had pulled all of the available reserve equipment for bridging and building pontoon bridges. A recent failed attack at Chasiv Yar suggests that a lack of bridging equipment is impacting Russian tactics. We are watching Karlivka closely to see how or if Russian forces will attempt to cross the Vovcha River. Now, let's talk about what happened on the battlefield. There have only been small changes since the last podcast. Ready? Here we go. Starting in the Kharkiv Oblast, we begin in the Lipty-Vovchansk area of operation, or AO. Ukrainian forces continued offensive operations in Vovchansk and made additional marginal gains. It was a similar situation north of Lipty, where heavy fighting continued. Across the border, in the Belgorod region of Russia, Ukrainian forces destroyed the electrical substation in Oktябrьsky. Fighting expanded in the Kupiansk AO, but was mostly positional attacks. Russian attempts to advance on Sinkivka, toward Petropavlivka from occupied Persotravneve and towards Stepovanovo-Selivka were repulsed. In the Svatove AO of Kharkiv and Luhansk oblasts, fighting continued in Berestove, where the situation was unchanged. Squad and platoon-sized Russian sabotage and reconnaissance units continued to operate near Stelmachivka and probed Ukrainian defenses at Novoyegorivka. In the Kremenna AO, Russian forces tried to advance in the direction of Nevske from occupied Zhitlivka and in the direction of Terny. None of the attacks were successful. In the Siversk AO of the Luhansk Oblast, Russian forces continued their significant attacks northeast, east and southeast of Bilohorivka, with no change to the situation. Let's talk about the Donbass and the northeastern part of the Donetsk Oblast. In the Konstantinivka AO, Russian forces continued their attacks on the edge of Chasiv Yar. Attempts to advance into Kalinivka and the canal district of Chasiv Yar were repulsed. A Russian attempt to advance through the forested belt north of Ivanivske to secure a strip where the Siversky Donetsk-Donbass canal goes underground ended catastrophically. Russian forces tried to use infantry fighting vehicles and tanks to support a light infantry attack, but they couldn't maneuver in the forested belt. A T-90M tank, 2 BMP infantry fighting vehicles and a Tiger AMRAP were destroyed. Light infantry troops had to advance across open space east of the forested belt and were subject to artillery strikes and drone attacks. Ukrainian forces channeled the remaining troops into kill boxes, ambushing the Russian attack squads. Further south, fighting continued within the no-man's land of Klishivka and southeast of Andriivka, with no change in the situation.
You're listening to the Malcontent News Russia-Ukraine War Podcast. Our team of journalists, researchers and analysts is funded by readers, listeners and viewers just like you. To support independent journalism, please consider becoming a patron. You can find us on patreon.com/malcontentnews.
In the southwestern part of the Donetsk Oblast, the heaviest fighting in Ukraine was in the Avdiivka AO, with Russian forces carrying out 37 attacks. Assaults were carried out from occupied Ocheretine in the directions of Novoalexandrivka, Progress, Yevgenivka and Sokil. Russian troops made marginal gains on the eastern edge of Novoalexandrivka. From occupied Novobakhmutivka, Russian forces carried out attacks in the direction of Novoselivka-Persha, without success. Heavy fighting continued east of the Karlovsky Reservoir and Vovcha River in the direction of Karlivka, where the situation for Ukrainian forces is described as very difficult. Russian forces also made a new attempt to advance on the village of Nevelske, without success. There continues to be significant fog of war in the Vuhledar AO. If we accepted every Russian report of new advances in Krasnohorivka over the last 45 days, the Russian flag should be flying over the city of Zaporizhia. If Russian troops are advancing, it is only a few meters at a time. Fighting was ongoing. Russian forces did advance south and southeast of Pobeda, pushing Ukrainian forces out of the western outskirts of the village. Fighting continued in Paraskoviivka and west of Solodka, with no change to the situation. In the Staromlynivka AO, Russian forces tried to advance north from occupied Novodonetsk and restarted attacks on the southern edges of Urozhaine and Staromayorsk. None of the attacks were successful. Here is my theater-wide update. Colonel Volodymyr Korobka has been named the new commander of the Ukrainian 92nd Separate Assault Brigade, replacing Colonel Pavlo Fedosenko, who had been the commander since May 2020. In 2022, the 92nd was one of Ukraine's most elite units that our analysts called the gods of war. The battalion suffered heavy losses in the defense of Soledar and Bakhmut in late 2022 and early 2023. President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky will meet with United States President Joe Biden and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in Normandy, France. Memorial services for the 80th anniversary of the D-Day invasion are being held on June the 6th. France initially invited Russia to attend, but later revoked the offer. During the upcoming G7 summit in Apulia, Italy, delegates will discuss global problems such as economic and food security, continued support for Ukraine, and leveraging frozen Russian assets to aid the Ukrainian war effort. During the summit, Zelensky is scheduled to have a second meeting with Biden. President Biden told the U.S. news organization Time that, quote, "Peace looks like making sure Russia never occupies Ukraine. That's what peace looks like. And it doesn't mean NATO. They are part of NATO. It means we have a relationship with them like we do with other countries where we supply weapons so they can defend themselves in the future. But I am not prepared to support the NATOization of Ukraine." Unquote. Biden went on to discuss his time as a U.S. Senator before 2008 and how there was, quote, "significant corruption in Ukraine." U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and U.S. Ambassador to NATO Julian Smith have both signaled that the wording regarding Ukraine's membership prospects would be changed at the July summit in Washington, D.C. Our assessment: imagine screams of frustration. If Ukraine doesn't have a path to NATO, Ukraine only has one logical path remaining to assure future state security. President Zelensky outlined the 3 points that would be discussed at the June 15th Peace Summit in Switzerland. It will call for the security of all nuclear power plants, including returning the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant to Ukrainian control, unrestricted access to Ukrainian ports for grain shipments to stabilize global food supplies, and an all-for-all prisoner exchange with Russia, including civilians and kidnapped Ukrainian children. Polish farmers backed by the pro-Putin Confederate Party have blocked the Rava-Ruska border checkpoint and plan to continue their protest through June the 6th. The renewed protests are allegedly about unanswered demands to reduce Ukrainian grain shipments. Propagandist, disgraced former U.S. military officer and convicted pedophile Scott Ritter changed his story today on Russian state media, talking with propagandist Vladimir Solovyov. Ritter said that his trip was being sponsored by the Novosibirsk Region Development Corporation head Alexander Zырянov, and he was told not to board the flight due to, quote, "legal problems." Ritter then claimed he told former judge Andrew Napolitano not to board the flight. Despite Ritter's earlier claim, there is no evidence that Napolitano was even on the plane in New York. On June the 3rd, Zырянov was accused of receiving a bribe of 9.5 million rubles and has been criminally charged with corruption. Russian state media agency TASS quoted Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, who said that the removal from the flight was understandable and, quote, "this is done almost in all countries with regard to former intelligence officers." It's time to talk about the land of Mobiks, Mobilization and the Mir. Russian state media sources reported that autocrat Vladimir Putin has been advised to wear body armor during outdoor public events. A recent photo of the Russian autocrat with the self-declared president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, suggests both were wearing bulletproof vests under their normal clothes. The Ministry of Finance raised its 2024 budget deficit estimate from 1.5 trillion rubles to 2.1 trillion. To help fill the budget shortfall, the ministry wants to raise income tax rates for individuals and corporations. Currently, Russians who make less than 5 million rubles a year are taxed at 13%, and those who make more at 15%. The proposal would create a progressive tax structure, with the highest income earners taxed at 22%. The Bank of Russia is expected to hold the lending rate at 16% due to continued inflationary pressure. Officially, Moscow is reporting inflation is at 5.6%, but outsiders believe the rate is much higher. Russia has become the largest supplier of oil to India and China, and strikes on refineries have forced Moscow to increase oil exports. Some OPEC officials are reportedly frustrated, and Russia has been slowly dialing back exports to the rest of its market over the last 4 weeks. Crude oil prices have cratered despite it being summer in the Northern Hemisphere. WTI crude oil is trading at $73.32 a barrel and Brent at $77.63. The prices are close to Russia's sanctioned limit of $60, minimizing the benefit from discount rates. To fully fund the government, Moscow needs oil at $100 a barrel without trade restrictions. We had reported over a year ago that China was not interested in the Power of Siberia 2 gas pipeline from Russia, and it appears that talks have officially collapsed. Beijing was only interested in small amounts of natural gas and insisted they pay internal Russian rates. Russian officials reportedly walked away from the negotiating table. And that's what we know. Your support of my home, Ukraine, helps us make history and protect the future for all.
You've been listening to the Malcontent News Russia-Ukraine War podcast. To help keep us independent, please consider providing financial support by becoming a patron. Want on-demand news in your hand? Download the Google News app and make Malcontent News one of your favorites to receive breaking news updates. Thank you for listening.